World history class, good day. Could be morning, could be night. Listen, get you some popcorn, get you a snack and a cold drink because we're going to be here a little bit. I got a lot of material to cover today, but we'll get it as quickly as possible. So hang in there and we're going to go through it. Starting chapter 19 on page 420. You were supposed to read this yesterday, and hopefully you did just that, as you said you did. Basically, we're going to talk about how our nations around the world came to exist as they exist today, or a lot of them. Your book starts by talking about America and how we expanded. The Louisiana Purchase was the first thing we got, and then we got Texas annexed, and we got more lands, and we got lands from Mexico, and on through different ways of obtaining them, and we stretched from sea to sea. And you'll see a map on page 422, which is a good map. It shows the different sections as they came on. You've got the original 13 colonies. You've got the land that we got in 1783. You've got where we picked up Florida. You've got the Louisiana Purchase. You've got the Texas annexation, Gadsden Purchase. You've got the Mexican Cession and the Oregon Country. And all of those different sections came to make up the United States. The problem we had with it, and this was the only problem, and it was not a major, this chair is so uncomfortable. I'm in a dining room today just to give a different perspective where y'all don't get bored of seeing me in the same couple of places. Your book talks about each section had different peoples and different ways of doing things. And the definitive difference would be like during the Civil War or leading up to the Civil War. You had the South that was agricultural and based on big cotton and a certain number of cash crops that they had. Slavery was big because we had large tracts of land that we had to farm. Where up north, the people lived more by industry, they lived more by business, they had small farms, and they tried to grow their own food, those type of things. So the two different cultures were different. Out west, you had Indians, and you had different things that ended up taking place there. So it was not an easy road, but it was doable, and the United States eventually overcame that. One of the big things you'll need to know about, I'm going to tilt this down, it's driving me crazy, the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine basically said, hey, Europe, you stay in your hemisphere, we'll stay in ours. We'll take care of ours, you take care of yours. Don't be over here interfering. And one thing that the United States is going to do, we're going to start trading with European countries. That was something we didn't do a lot of, but we're going to start trading with European countries. And then we're going to compete with them later on to try to cater to China. China. Give it to me one time. China. We're going to try to compete for trade with China and trade with Japan. One of the challenges to the Monroe Doctrine took place because of Napoleon III. He wanted to build an empire in the New World, and he sent French troops into Mexico and placed an archduke by the name of Maximilian in charge of the country. And we saw it as an infringement to the Monroe Doctrine. Now, what happened is this all took place during our Civil War, or the War of Northern Aggression, or the war between the states, or whatever you want to call it. There's dozens of names for it. But this took place during that time, and Abraham Lincoln knew it was going on, but he was like, I ain't got too much on the plate. We're fighting a war in our country. So we didn't do anything. After the war, Andrew Johnson lined up troops on our border with Mexico and basically threatened them. And Napoleon III withdrew his troops from Mexico. They ended up hanging or executing Maximilian in 1867. One of the other things that happened was in 1890. This had to do with yellow journalism, and you'll get into that more in U.S. history when you take it next. But the USS Maine was sent to Havana because we had heard that there was bad treatment of people in Cuba. And the Cubans were trying to get independence. So we send the Maine down there, and the Maine blows up. Now, we don't know how. A lot of people assumed, and might have made a proper assumption, that it was done by Spain. Spain was, the culprits mistreating the Cubans who were wanting independence. And so we blamed Spain. We used the slogan, "Remember the Maine," as opposed to "Remember the Alamo." We're real original when it comes to things like that. And 260 American soldiers died on the Maine, by the way, so it was a big deal. Congress declared war, and we sent troops into Cuba. We fought. The Spaniards gave up. They surrendered. And as a result, the United States got Guam, we got Puerto Rico, and we got the Philippines. So we got some territory out of that war. Also, Roosevelt came up with the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. This was Teddy Roosevelt. And basically, he exclaimed that, hey, if there's wrongdoing in Latin America, the United States has the right to go in and try to correct the problem. That it's not up to Europe to take care of it. If there's something going on wrong in Latin America, because that's in our hemisphere, we'll take care of it. Then your book goes on, this is page 424, talks about Great Britain. Their big slogan, "The sun never sets on our empire." It was that big. They had Canada, they had Australia, they had New Zealand, they had South Africa. Canada was one of those weird things, started out as a French colony. Your book talks about that. And then during the French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War, but we call it the French Indian War, Britain won. And so Britain got control of Canada. And to make a long story short, the Quebec Act of 1774 was put into place. And it allowed French Canadians to retain their culture, to retain their language, their laws, their customs, those type of things. That's why when I went to Quebec years ago, as I was about your age, I think I was maybe 15 or 16, I went to Quebec and I went to Montreal. When I went to Quebec, people were walking around speaking en français. And I was taking French at the time, or had taken French in high school, and I could not string a sentence together. But I tried to order coffee in a restaurant using French, and they looked at me like a mule looking at a new gate. They didn't know what I was saying. But later on, loyalists during the American Revolution, they're going to flee to Canada. And as a result, the French are nervous that, hey, they're going to take over. We're going to lose our rights. And long story short, they came up with the British North American Act. It created the provinces that we have today, with the exception of one for the Inuits that you'll get into more later on. But Quebec, Ontario, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, they all became part of the British Empire, but Britain allowed them self-government. So who is the Queen of Canada? It is Queen Elizabeth as it stands right now. Canada, in essence, belongs to Great Britain, but they govern themselves. They have their own parliament, they have their own laws, that type of thing. One of the strange situations in the world. Your book also mentions Australia and New Zealand. If you get a chance, look up some about James Cook. Pretty neat individual. He did a lot of stuff, but he was brave enough to sail around Australia. He explored the eastern coast of Australia, and as a result, that's the way things worked, and we talked about that when we talked about exploration. If you explored a country, it pretty much belonged to you. You could claim it. Hey, this is ours. Even though you had indigenous people living there, you could still claim it. And Australia became important because of our Revolutionary War here in America. Great Britain, when they had political prisoners or financial prisoners, but debtor's prison, to save space on the prisons in Great Britain, they would send them to the penal colony by the name of Georgia. And so that's what Georgia was. It was a prison colony, and they would send their prisoners there. But in 1775, When war starts to break out, they're like, what do we do now? So they sent them to Australia. And it became a penal colony for Great Britain. So that's kind of how they settled that. And anyway, Captain Cook later on forms another exploration, and New Zealand becomes involved. They become a self-governing dominion of the British Empire, but still belong to Great Britain. South Africa was another thing. You have the Boer War, and if you read about the Boer War, they fled into the interior of Africa. They formed a couple of free states, and when they formed these free states, Great Britain just kind of left them alone. Until one day, there was a desolate farm in the northern part of the Cape Colony of South Africa, and a little boy found this pretty stone. That's how he described it, pretty stone. He gave it to his sister, and she was playing with it in this little game she had. A salesman came by one day. It was laying on the kitchen floor, and he said, "Hey, can I have that?" Well, he got it examined. It was a 21.5 carat diamond, 21.5 carats. And that wasn't big in itself, but it was taken to Paris to be put on display at the Paris exhibition of 1867. As a result, then there was a diamond rush for South Africa. There was also a gold rush in South Africa. And the Boers, who had established their own, like the Orange Free State and Transvaal, Great Britain says, "Hey, wait a minute, not so fast," and they go in and they take over those as well. They extended their control over those two republics. Latin America was a little different. It was similar to the way the United States gained their independence, but American colonies were tightly controlled. Latin American colonies were tightly controlled by Spain and Portugal. There are some terms you need to see, and they're all in bold, italicized here. Peninsulaires. They were Spanish-born, reared in Spain. So they are people, purebred Spanish, that come over here to the country. They were the ones that controlled everything. So if you were a peninsulaire, you're from the peninsula of Spain, then you get to control things. You've lived there, you were raised there, you were born there. The Creoles, Spaniards born in the New World. So they're Spanish descent, but they were born here. They did not have as much power, and they resented that. You also had the mestizos. They were mixed Spanish and Indian blood. So they are ones that mixed in with the Indians here. And you have blacks that basically were treated the same way in Mexico and Latin America as they were here in this country at the time. And you see several people, Simon Bolivar, Jose de San Martin. You also see Dom Pedro. I want you to read about those. There are different ways that these countries became independent. Some of them through revolution. Most of the time, they would rise up, they would get a faction, a coalition together, and they would try to overthrow the military leaders. One of them tried to do it by election. That took place in Mexico. Diaz, Porfirio Diaz, can't say that. He promised an election in 1876, and he campaigned for it, but he becomes a dictator. And there was a guy by the name of Francisco Madero, and he ran against Diaz in a presidential election, and Madero won, but Diaz challenged the results. And so as a result of that, Diaz had to create a revolution. Mexico did not become free until 1910. So you see how those things work in Latin America. And it talks about some of the problems of self-government real quickly. I'll go through those. Political instability. That is always a problem with self-government. We even face that problem here in this country. We could have had a politically unstable government, thank goodness, and thank God, literally, that we were able to stabilize it and function. Monopoly of land and wealth by a few. We've seen that even in this country at times, but more so in the European culture. The landowners, it goes back to the feudal system. powerful influence of the Roman Catholic Church in Spain and Portugal. In the New World, the Roman Catholic Church was just sucking up land. They were getting the land because it was valuable, and the mineral rights and all the things that came along with the land. The church was making a killing over here. Ethnic disunity. You've got blacks, you've got the Peninsulaires, you've got the Creoles, you've got all of these people that are involved, and there's disunity amongst them. They're not getting along, and it makes it hard to govern people that don't get along. Same with the Balkan states. I think I mentioned that in class, that the Balkans, we call it Balkanization. People want to be, or tend to want to be, with people that are just like them and of the same ethnicity or same background or same culture. You see that in big cities. You have Chinatown, and you have the Spanish markets and these things. People tend to be around people that they're familiar with, and you see this ethnic disunity caused a lot of problems in governing these countries as they became free. Conflict among Latin American countries. People didn't want to stay within their borders. They wanted to have wars, and they wanted to have one big country as opposed to several small ones. Economic weakness. It was hard for a lot of these Latin American countries, especially, to get off the ground. Okay, what are we going to sell? What are we going to make? What are we going to produce? How are we going to make money? How are we going to have a good economy? I mean, when you're looking at bananas and coffee and rubber and wood, it's hard to make a big economy. And especially, you have a year with no rain or a year with too much rain, what happens? So that was one of the problems. In European and U.S. involvement, the U.S. would intervene. They didn't want Europe intervening. And when the U.S. would intervene, these nations would get mad at the United States. So these were some of the problems they had. My goodness, I've gone a long time, 17 minutes. But here's what I want you to do. Make sure you're familiar with all of that information, because we will be tested on it. We're going to talk about imperialism tomorrow, and that is going to go through page 436. So a pretty good clip there. Here's what I want you to do, and I'll close with this. On page 429, you see 5 questions. 5 questions. The star we've already covered pretty extensively, but questions 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 on page 429. I want you to do those. It's the section quiz, page 429. Get that done, turn it in, and we'll work on the next section tomorrow. Miss y'all. Have a great day.